hear us well. So welcome to the first of the 3 webinars in the Local Government Energy Saver program, being run by SV in partnership with Ironbark Sustainability. First of all, some intros. I'm Tom Brown. I'm the Strategic Coordinator for Hume for Sustainability Victoria. We have
Alexi Lynch from Ironbark Sustainability, the Business Manager at Ironbark.
Matt Sullivan-Kilgour, the Head of Analytics for Iron.
Thanks, gents. So just a little bit of housekeeping first up. So today's webinar will run for around 2 hours and we hope to be finished by about midday. There's a Q&A panel on your screen that you can type questions into. There's no audio function for listeners, but we'll be monitoring those questions and we'll do our best to answer those during the course of the presentations. And the webinars will be recorded. The recording's live now, and we'll make that available via a YouTube video following the webinars. So there's 3 webinars, just as a recap. The first one, obviously, today is greenhouse gas reporting for corporate and community. And then following on towards the end of this month and mid-June, there's 2 more, which you can see there on the slide. Just a little recap of the Local Government Energy Saver program, of which these webinars are part of. The program is working with 22 resource constrained councils, and these webinars are really an extension of that program and are aiming to share the outcomes of Stream 1 with all Victorian local governments. So the Local Government Energy Saver program is a non-competitive funding program working with 22 eligible Victorian councils. Across 3 streams of work, which you can see there, and the program is slated to finish in mid-2020. And just a further note, and something to look out for in your inbox over the next months, SV is currently developing a carbon accounting training package for local government officers to complement these webinars and give you some more of the nuts and bolts in carbon accounting to help you become proficient carbon accounting practitioners. So just before we get into the webinar proper, I thought it would be interesting just to link what we're doing today to the global action on climate change that we see in the news and all around us. So back in 2015, the Earth agreed to try and limit global warming to 2 degrees. Victoria set a zero net emissions target by 2050 in 2016. The Take 2 program was established by the state government with SV to support the achievement of that 2050 net zero target. And then the Local Government Energy Saver program was established last year to support resource constrained councils to create carbon inventories and reduction plans, set science-based targets, and those science-based targets are then consistent with the zero net emissions target in Victoria, which is supportive of the global agreement to try and limit global warming to 2 degrees. So by sharing the outcomes of Local Government Energy Saver Stream 1 today, we're connecting some local action to local leaders to help connect to the global action and global campaign for mitigating climate change. So, on to the first webinar. Today we'll be looking at corporate greenhouse gas inventories. We'll be exploring what an emissions scope is. We'll be looking at the Local Government Saver inventory tool. And we'll be exploring community greenhouse gas profiles as well. So without further ado, we'll switch over to Ironbark's presentation and we will get going. And don't forget to type those questions in as they come to mind. All right, Lex, over to you. Just click through those there to shuttle back and forward.
Thanks, Tom.
No
Thanks
worries.
for having us. Hello, everybody. It's great to be here presenting on emissions reporting. I'm just going to give a really quick intro and overview on what we're going to talk about today, and then going to hand you to Matt, who's going to start to get the ball rolling. No, that's not going to work. I need to use this, don't I?
Yep.
So we've got about 2 hours. We're going to spend the first half really looking at corporate greenhouse emissions inventories, and also a little bit on the Local Government Energy Savers inventory tool. So through the program that Tom was talking about, we've developed a tool that can essentially be used to develop inventories for councils. And then the second half is looking at community inventories or profiles. We're calling them profiles, and instead of inventories, and we'll get into that in a bit of detail as well when we get to that, and that's the second half. And also rethinking community greenhouse gas inventories, looking at the history over the last 15 or 20 years of councils developing community profiles, and the successes and some of the challenges that we've had, and a bit of QA. We're going to keep this really informal. If we get a feel that we're pitching it too high or too low, we'll adapt accordingly. And although we've got time for Q&A at the end, I think we'll just keep the questions coming throughout as well. So if there's anything that one of us has brought up and you want to go into it in a bit more detail, then please just jump in with those questions. When we get into the community inventory or community profiles especially, we've got someone here on my right, I don't know how that works looking on the screen, Matt, who was involved in developing the international protocol, which is called GPC. So keep the questions coming, and you can also, of course, follow up with any afterwards. Just also might note that Tom's points around the linkages to the international programs and to the Paris Agreement comes through a little bit today, and a lot more as well in the next two webinars. So the next one is on data management, and then the one after that is on science drive targets. There's a bit of a crossover between this one and the next one when it comes to the data side of things. So we might only touch on data a little bit in this one. And the third one will be looking a lot more into how the work and these programs and these issues link into what's happening internationally, which is quite exciting, really. All right, I'm going to now pass to Matt to move on corporate greenhouse gas inventories. Now, I'm going to try not to cause an incident report here and get coffee and water everywhere.
There we go.
Over to you, Matt.
Sure. So we're obviously taking a look at the corporate greenhouse gas inventory and like how councils should be approaching it. So like when we're taking a look at any sort of inventory that's done, be it corporate or be it at community or some other level, it's really important to consider exactly what the intent of the inventory is, because there's no such thing as an absolute, complete, true inventory that will suit all of your needs. It needs to be created in response to a specific expectation. And those expectations might vary. So like one of them, and one of the sort of key roles it's played in the past is ability to track how emissions change over time and to be able to track, say, the efficacy of programs to reduce emissions. And so for something of that intent, it makes sense for the boundary of your emissions profile to focus on the areas for which you are looking to take action. Other application areas are where you are looking to do comparisons to other municipalities, in which case working to a common standard is effective. So we're going to just talk a bit about what those common standards are and what the implications are for how they should be approached from an inventory perspective. Now, as you can see from the slide, so there's a few of the classic areas that you would include in your corporate emissions profile. Stationary energy associated with buildings is a universal component. One area which is still within the stationary buildings aspect, but the stationary energy aspect, but sort of warrants its own branch out, is street lighting. We also have fleet, so emissions associated with vehicle use by the council, and then waste emissions as well. Waste emissions get a little bit more complicated because we can have two sort of categories of that. So one is waste originating from the corporate activities itself, and the second is waste emitting from the, if any actual facility, waste treatment facilities are operated by council. So just to get a better understanding, there's a convention that is very frequently used or universally used within emissions inventorying, and that's scopes. So scopes 1, 2, and 3. Functionally, there is actually really only scopes 1 and 3, and scope 2 is simply a special case. So scope 1 is emissions that are associated with that you directly produce yourself. So that means, say, in a specific activity, you burn some gas, and that gas produces carbon dioxide. Then they count as scope 1 emissions. Now, notably, just as a way to sort of understand how this all contextualizes, when we're talking about emissions and the release of emissions that going towards greenhouse gas totals, we're talking about the production of emissions of previously stored or locked carbon. So that means that emissions associated with, say, burning of wood, if they're combusted to complete CO2, they actually don't count. Right, so it's when we're combusting fossil fuels, basically, that they count. So stuff that had previously been stored and was not part of the biosphere has now been released into that. So that means when we're looking at Scope 1, so the classic components of that are gas, fleets, and waste disposal when you as an organisation are responsible for the management and treatment of that waste. So then Scope 2 is a special case of Scope 3. So Scope 2 is basically network supplied energy where the emissions for that supply is from outside of your operation. So functionally in Australia, that refers pretty much exclusively to electricity. There are a few other network supplied energy sources that can be included as well. And Scope 3 is like everything else, right? So that's essentially, if you are not, say, owning the asset, then that's typically, but there's consumption associated with it, and that's that would be a Scope 3 inclusion. Waste treatment that occurs outside of your operations or boundaries are Scope 3s, and also, just as an interesting correlation with electricity, the transmission and distribution of electricity is a Scope 3, weirdly. So the scopes, the best way to think about scopes is essentially as a measure of control. So Scope 1s essentially are supposedly directly in your control, and Scope 3s are things that are more outside of your direct control. Now, when we're talking about how to go about doing assessment, if you're operating just wholly in isolation and you're simply using your product, your inventories to try and understand a way that you're trending over time, you would actually not need to use any protocols. The point of protocols is to try and essentially connect with what's going on elsewhere. So functionally in Australia, we sort of have one key protocol that's used, and that's the National Greenhouse Energy Reporting, NGERS. And this is a specific reporting tool that was developed for the purposes of documenting emissions from larger emissions sources, and as a way of corporate reporting and tracking. And then there were previously implications of having emissions above certain thresholds. Now there are requirements nominally to that obligate NGERS reporting if your emissions exceed certain parameters, such as 25,000 tonnes per facility or 50,000 tonnes per organisation, so coherent organisational body. However, for many councils, particularly if you're not running your own landfills, then you're unlikely to be exceeding these thresholds, which makes NGERS sort of, it's like an optional guideline. Now, it's a useful means of doing reporting because it's a common framework. It's like the common framework. So it allows for easy comparisons with what's going on with other entities and the like. Also, if you have an intention of being compliant with NCOS, the National Carbon Offset Standard, so you want to become carbon neutral, then you will be required to report using the NGERS tool as a way of demonstrating that compliance. There are other standards out there. An example here is ISO. So the ISO standards, this is an international convention. This can be used as well. It's not very commonly used in Australia. There are some implications about things that ISO looks at that NGERS and other formats don't particularly look at, so particularly upstream emissions and so embedded emissions associated with products. So it's very possible to look at that. It's also very possible to sort of mix and match your approaches. Again, I would emphasize that the points should always be, looking at strategically, what is this inventory trying to do for us, and what are we, where do we go with it? One thing that IMBARC emphasizes a lot is that it should be the case that the costs of maintaining inventories, you should be focusing on keeping them low. So that means that you're not essentially expending a lot of time and effort in what is simply just like an accounting tool, and you can redirect those funds more effectively. But also, if the emphasis is put there, that means it takes less pressure, it takes some pressure off the need for those inventories to be highly flexible. The need for those inventories to be very specifically defined, and allows you to make them flexible And so you could potentially pursue a couple of different strategies simultaneously. So when just taking a look a bit more specifically at the corporate emissions, so when we're saying, so collating scope 1 and 2 GHG emissions plus street lighting, so typically this will include fleets, so light and heavy vehicles, electricity consumption, including street lighting, emissions associated with potable water use, waste management, gas consumption. These are the typical headings that you will encounter. Now, there are a couple of different ways to approach this. So if we're looking at emissions reporting from essentially just a tracking of like overall trends and like the GHG, so the global carbon impact of the council, then the resolution that's required for that reporting is not that high. Typically so really we're just looking for an aggregate total and making sure the appropriate category is included. Really, it's the case that when, like the real driver for improving the resolution, so essentially the subdivisions of your emissions inventory, is when you are interested in using this inventory as a way of driving action. So you're trying to understand where your emission sources are and sort of identify opportunities and track the impact of any actions taken to try and rectify those opportunities. This is really the driver for improved accuracy and resolution in your inventories. And it's actually significantly more effective application of like an inventory rather than simply just as a reporting tool. So here's just going through the scopes again, just talking about those categories. Obviously, there's a lot of language to support this. Now, there's just, while we're going through this, it's just not a bad idea to keep in mind. There are some variations between how these scopes and the attributions and the creation of inventories differ between corporate and municipal, which increasingly is using the GPC, the Global Protocol Framework. Some of these scopes they treat differently, and so it's like again, this just sort of goes back to like just trying to understand what is the point of your inventory. I think that's always should be front and foremost in your thoughts. There needs to be very much a point. So in Australia, we are fortunate in that we have a nationally recognised greenhouse accounts factors. This is a document that not only documents a bunch of coefficients associated with things such as electricity use, gas use, transport fuel emissions, and those kind of things, but it also has a whole bunch of information in regards to methods for how do you aggregate some of these sources for larger emissions. This is a good point to sort of indicate there are, in fact, in Australia, 2 key documents about how to go about estimating emissions from various sources across society. And their sort of application areas somewhat intersect. So the 2 areas are NGERS, as we went through before, so that's essentially a rule set for corporate emissions. And then there's the National Emissions Guidelines documents, the 2008 published document that outlines basically aggregate emissions. So that's looking at emissions typically at the municipal or higher levels. So they're 2, so within IMBARC, we use the language. So the first one describes an inventory where you're dealing very specifically with a data set that you have very high resolution on and you're directly measuring. And the second one is we call like a profile. So that's where you've got coarser, more aggregated information, and it's designed to be a representation of areas.
Matt, can we just stop there for a second? Got a couple of questions.
Mm-hmm.
The first one, just stepping back briefly around Scope 3 and emissions from electricity transmission and distribution.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, you mentioned Scope 3, transmission and distribution of electricity, but is that different to Scope 2 of electricity? Can you just clarify that for us?
Absolutely, sure. So Scope 2 is the emissions associated with the production of the electricity. So it's basically, say, if you were to burn some coal in a power plant, and then that's the emissions associated with that combustion, and the conversion, subsequent conversion, is the Scope 2 emissions associated with that electricity. Scope 3 is simply the losses of the electricity as it travels through the transmission and distribution lines. So typically in Victoria, we see a loss of an average of 11% for that distribution. And so that's essentially like a subset of scope 2 emissions that are allocated to simply getting the electricity to where you're using it. There are a couple of additional complexities around that, such as that scope 2 figure doesn't include the emissions associated with the operations of the plant itself, and in fact are simply representing the actual conversion of the gas independent of those to supply the electricity. And also, it's worth bearing in mind, this is an aggregate figure. So basically what they do is they take, for over a year, they take a sum of all of the energy that was supplied from all the different sources and sort of figure out what the average figure for that was. Practically speaking, if we were to get into that, is that like on a minute-by-minute basis, the actual true emissions of the kilowatt hour say being supplied right now will naturally vary substantially over the day as the supply varies from, combined cycle gas to wind to coal.
Great, thanks, Matt. And just another one, just a clarity around emissions from waste. We might touch on that again when we look at the tool, but should corporate inventories of councils include emissions from waste collected from the community,
right,
or just council
Sure.
emissions from council generated waste?
Well, again, this is something that you potentially could make some decisions about yourself. If we're taking a look from a protocol perspective, then the way NGERS approaches it is essentially it's the operational side of where the waste is being handled. So for all protocols, the convention is that you include waste generated by the municipality, by your council itself. Incorporating waste from community, the convention is for NGERS that you would include it if you yourself were operating the facilities that the treatment took place, and if you were not, you would not include it. For GPC for community, and we'll discuss that more in detail later, it focuses, the way that it approaches waste is it approaches it from a generation side rather than a treatment side. So that means that from your municipalities, even if the waste was shipped off to like China, for instance, because it was generated in your municipality, it would be added to your total. And even if you had a waste treatment site in your municipal boundaries that the council operated, but it took waste from like 8 other municipalities, then you would only include your proportion of the waste that would be going into that. So this is important how GPC approaches that problem for NGERS. So NGERS, for instance, if you operate the site, it would include the waste from all 8 municipalities, but for your for GPC, it would include your contribution.
All right, so it's a complex space, but I think there's a couple more questions just come through, and we might have a go at those because they are covering what we've just talked about. So there's one question here specifically around the National Greenhouse Accounts, which is, a pretty big document.
Yep.
The question is, it's difficult to find your way through that document,
Yep,
to find those perhaps a dozen factors that are really important for local governments. Have you got any tips on how to identify, navigate your way through that document to find those key factors?
So not having a heap of time.
Yeah.
So we basically consolidated the relevant data points. So when we do reporting, we present those as part of our profile. In regards to like navigating through it functionally, there's it's not a document that's designed to do that. So functionally, you're really only looking at a small handful of variables. And so those are the emissions coefficients, scopes 2 and 3 for electricity, the emissions associated with diesel and unleaded fuel, post 2004 probably, so without getting too specific.
Yeah.
One thing we could do is we could just send through some notes about which pages they're on. Right?
Sure.
And what the table numbers are that they're identified. That's probably the easiest way to do it.
And perhaps in webinar 2 data,
Yep.
we can show some screenshots or something, or some lists of those important coefficients. So there are a few questions coming through. We'll do our best to try and cover them all, but a good one to bring up now is what about projections for greenhouse gas emissions factors into the future?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Right, so this is an area that we're actively working with. So I've been involved with doing projections for a little while, and I actually find it really amusing that how much variability there is in regards to like what projections are made. And essentially, it's a combination of understanding like what we expect to happen in regards to electricity consumption, because that's going to strongly dictate essentially what the energy balance is going to be, and we need to overlay that with development of expansion and replacement of the grid. So one of the things that has complicated that, so I guess right now we're just talking specifically about coefficients associated with grid supplied energy. One of the substantial factors that have influenced that is that classic modeling was essentially a continuous growth of electricity consumption as a function of economic growth. So since 2009, we've had decoupling of that effect. Now, this sounds a little semantic, but it actually is really influential in understanding what's happening with the emissions coefficients, because previously the growth of electricity was assumed, it was assumed that electricity consumption would continue to grow, and it would be the case that, say, new initiatives would look to phase in, so we could sort of transition towards greener supplies of energy, and it would essentially lead to an incremental lowering of that emissions just by stints of having just incremental growth in renewables. Because we're not, we've in 2015, 2016, we've seen a bit of an upsurge, so we're still not sure what the trend is going to be. But what it means basically is that there's not a continuous growth. So that means essentially any plants that come online are sort of making decisions around going like the economic balance changes. So it's like talking about replacement of existing stock. So it's that's a different sort of question and conversation. So that means, look, the reason why I'm going through this is that it highlights the fact there's a pretty high degree of uncertainty in exactly how those figures are going to change.
Yeah.
So we do some projections around what we're thinking that's going to be, but like as long, we make the assumptions associated with it transparent, but we just need to recognize that there's not good clarity. The direction that's been put forward, particularly the latest federal government's proposal, does not place significant drivers on further greening the grid. And so that just further complicates the picture, because the transition was still occurring. But yeah, anyway.
Can I add 1 or 2 points there?
Yeah, go for it, Lex.
So, and what Matt said is spot on, and it's sort of very similar to the cost of energy into the future, 5-10 years time.
Yeah.
That decoupling of GDP growth with energy use through that period essentially was a large reason why we had massive increases in electricity prices residential over that period, because we thought that electricity demand was going to increase as GDP increased, but instead we actually had a reduction. In the meantime, we've built all these poles and wires, and so we've just overcapitalised on the grid, which means that we all pay for it. If you can predict what the electricity prices will be in 2, 5, 10 years time, you're a genius, or you're lucky. It's probably more the point, because I don't think anyone has had much luck doing that. You can rely on EMO figures, but they're generally off by a significant amount. And the other,
you can rely on EMO figures, like as in they're a common point of reference.
Yeah, but it's often off by a long shot. And I guess the questions come from Raj. My question back to you would be, who's going to win the next election? Because politics comes into it a lot as well. Obviously, if we get a change in government and we get a different renewable energy target, then the electricity mix in the grid is going to be very different in 2025 as to what it would be under a different government. So there's a lot of balls in the air.
A best informed guess, and making sure you have that the evidence to justify why you made a decision about future emissions if you're planning steps to reduce your
point Matt made about
emissions.
Transparency is pretty key as well, as it is with reporting for corporate or for community. It's like a general accounting. Transparency is number one.
This actually really highlights another important point in regards to that one thing that we look to make in general, is that we view inventories and profiles as essentially sort of guiding tools, so things that can help make decisions and can be used to track things such as the efficacy of individual initiatives. But when we take a look at the overall figures for, say, emissions associated with a particular like council operations or projecting into the future, there's a lot of variables that are implicit, particularly once we talk projections, a lot of variables that are implicit in that. So we need to understand that there's a degree of uncertainty associated with those figures. And it's really worthwhile for all of us to basically embrace and understand that uncertainty and realize that it's by not doing that, by not sort of actively saying like, we realize like, we've got essentially like a projection range or an uncertainty associated with this, and the figures will need to be revised, and understanding that, basic things such as, the possibility of revising previous profiles and inventories so that they're in sync with the same accounting methods and basic factors as new information comes to the table. This needs to remain a possibility. But if the information is presented in such a way that essentially locks the council or your organisation into it definitively needs to be this set of figures, particularly if that definitive definition of figures are in the future, then that basically locks you in a very problematic situation, and it's essentially making an assumption about the level of certainty that just doesn't exist.
All right. Well, there's two questions, so we might just quickly address those, and then we'll get back into the webinar guts of it. So just a quick question around street lighting. Can we just identify why councils are recording street lighting, which scope it fits into?
Sure.
And then why they should be accounted for it?
Well, so the reasons being like a really excellent reason is because it's an area that councils can push and take action on, and it's extremely effective. Which is, so we've got two aspects to it. One is obviously a bit of a self-serving one, like as in it makes a really good story, like it makes like a demonstration of very good efficacy. Secondly, and what I would certainly argue is the more important one, is that council is the entity that would take action on this. Like they're footing the bills, they're the ones directly motivated to take action on this. It is an area that is extremely amenable to very effective action. And it would, by including the inventory, basically it creates a situation that prioritizes that action. So we would say that those are the justifications for including it.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, and just the last one, and then we'll have to move on. But we've talked a little bit about emissions from waste, from landfills, or waste collection, and it's a complex area, but a popular one. Mm-hmm. Emissions from landfills that are closed.
Yes.
How do we account for that?
Sure. So this gets into an interesting area in that. Sorry, guys. So basically, what it actually indicates is that when we talk about emissions associated with waste, there is actually an intersection between two fundamentally different ways of approaching emissions calculations. So the first way is effectively what we refer to as a deeming approach. So basically it takes waste that's currently being deposited and it makes an estimate of what we think the emissions for that waste will be going into the future. And when you take a look at the sort of the calculations that are used to do that, so it's basically a log derived reduction over time. So it's sort of exponentially dropping off over time. What we see is that means we see functional waste emissions for that waste occurring sort of 30 to 40 years into the future. Right, but what we do is we calculate a figure to say we think that all of the emissions associated with that waste over that entire period will be X amount. That's a deeming approach. When we're looking at, say with NGERS doesn't use that. NGERS uses a legacy approach. So legacy is where what you do is you basically measure or count all of the emissions for your different waste streams, so say municipal or C&D and C&I.
Which is commercial and industrial and
construction and demolition. And you take those figures and you basically do an estimate for each of those figures over time. And so that means you've got numbers for like how much waste was deposited in 1978, 1979, 1980, all those years up until the current, right? And so obviously that would work for even landfills that were closed. And then what happens is there's a certain log equation that's derived and sort of based on some empirical evidence, which itself is quite interesting. That then calculates your number. So that's essentially how it would be done. And then there's additional complexity that when you're talking about flaring, things such as flaring, methane cogeneration, that kind of stuff, because methane flaring and cogeneration fundamentally is a legacy derived figure. So it obviously is deriving methane from waste that was previously in landfill. In fact, waste that's currently being deposited is broadly not even part of the methane collection network. So there's absolutely no connection to it. The methane collection it's quite difficult to sort of heuristically determine what the proportion of flaring would be for methane. Like it is something that will generally need to be collected directly from the flaring sites.
Right. there is one more question. This will have to be it till we move on. But back to emissions factors, and we will cover these more in webinar 2. But Beck from East Gippsland's just asked, why is the emissions factor for electricity in Victoria gone from 1.19 down to 1.08? Is that what does that reflect in the electricity mix?
Well, that's
Probably Hazelwood.
yeah. So Hazelwood closing
Yep.
is a very significant factor. There's but there has been a downward trajectory in the emissions associated with Victoria for some time. It's interesting actually in the energy balance that we're using. So obviously we've been having wind coming on board, and there's a whole separate conversation to be had in regards to like what constitutes electricity balance and is there such thing as base load and that kind of effect. But essentially, so we've had wind undermining the consumption of, what has classically been the world of coal, so the baseline overnight loads. And we've also had, we increasingly are having what's called a peaky network. So that's where the actual capacity, delivered capacity of the network is going down and it's getting a bit more peaky. And so peaky networks typically require, and the reason why it's peaking is because that peakiness is usually such as short-term high demand things such as air conditioning. And so the peaky networks typically require faster dispatch solutions as well. So that means generally you will see a bit more of a transition towards combined cycle gas and stuff that's got, fast, say half an hour or less startup intervals.
Great. All right.
Cool. So just going a little bit more into the specifics of council inventories. So this right here is an example of a typical council inventory, and we just say typical broadly, but essentially what you can see is that the majority is from electricity use within buildings. We see some plant and other equipment, street lighting's forming 23% or so. There's contributions from fleets. There's some gas use, and there's also a corporate waste component. Obviously, what this highlights is that generally, and this will be a fairly universal constant, is that electricity, stationary energy building use is, very effective areas to take action on. There are, however, variations of this. So, for instance, if you have as yet to take action on street lighting, then that component will increase dramatically. Basically, the technology exists now that just dramatically decreases the operational and maintenance and utility consumption of streetlights, and that has a huge impact on the council inventory and also the council bottom line. So this is one of the reasons why both from a global perspective and also from an individual council's interest perspective, street lighting is an excellent area to take action on. And then when we look at a council that's, say, more in a rural area, generally what we'll see is a substantive increase in the size of the fleet consumption, and realise this is in a proportion of total council consumption. So generally you'll see a significant reduction in consumption overall, but that consumption shifts to fleet. Also, so electricity building use is substantial. There is some water energy use. Now I'd flag, talking strategically, water use is actually a really problematic area for a lot of councils because it's so variable and it incorporates a bunch of factors for which councils have little control over. So when we're looking, when we're advising and talking to councils on how to approach this, it can be the case that discretionary or say variable water use is something that could be viewed as a separate factor. So something outside of, say, the general council operations totals. There's a really good example the council I was working with that saw between two reporting years, saw a 2,600% increase in electricity associated with water use, so water pumping and the likes, water handling. And that was entirely due to the fact that the starting year was a regular year and the ending year was a drought year and then a flood year, so within that same reporting period. So, and that's an extreme example, but it's not an unusual example, and that something like that, so something that has that degree of variability can substantially undermine the messaging around efficacy of emissions reductions. So it's a good idea to bear that in mind up front when looking to incorporate this into targets and trajectories.
Matt, there's been a question asked about emissions from water consumption, and we've touched on it there about emissions associated perhaps with the pumping of water.
Yes.
What about, say, the use of potable water and things like that, or maybe the treatment of discharge water into sewage systems? How do we account for that in greenhouse gas reporting?
Yeah, sure. So the conventional approach is to basically take to only incorporate the energy associated with water use when you as an organization are directly responsible for the supply of that electricity. So if you're running the facilities that are doing, moving that water around. Obviously, water supply has an embedded energy cost. So it is certainly plausible to incorporate that energy use into your profile. It's sort of as a way of connecting water use into the carbon emissions language, rather than simply dealing with it as a separate metric in and of itself. That's actually, in my eyes, a very useful way of measuring it, because it's difficult to quantify, say, the value of water environmentally outside of looking at the GHG implications. You sort of need to create some sort of contextual framework, and that's going to be dependent essentially on weather conditions and other environmental factors. So you can incorporate it. It's not conventionally incorporated, though. Usually it's dealt with as a separate measure.
All right, so there's a little bit of interest in accounting for emissions from potable water use and raw water use. So there's another question come through in terms of emission factors or emissions that are embodied in water use. Do they vary between regions, so between municipalities?
Yes, absolutely,
and they vary obviously between potable treated water out of the tap and raw water.
Sure, yeah, so if they have different supply paths, yeah, then they'll vary. So there currently isn't an existing well-established standard for how to establish what the appropriate coefficients for emissions associated per kilolitre of water are. The approach that you would take would be, for it to be practical, the approach you would take would be to get the electricity consumption associated with electricity, with pumping use, for the relevant authority and get a representative figure for that. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that that figure itself will actually likely vary substantially, both geographically and also over time for that particular authority, depending on a bunch of different characteristics. But getting a representative figure, such as an annual, sort of kilolitres of water supply divided by electricity supply divided by the kilolitres of water supply, would be a good representative figure. That sort of approach is a similar approach that is taken for things such as doing an estimate of, say, the emissions intensity of, say, trams or trains, right? So you look at the electricity supply to that network. There are a bunch of complexities with how to basically obtain that information if you yourself are not running the facilities. So that means it's difficult to go, be more prescriptive beyond sort of that overarching statement.
And also with some of the urban water authorities in Victoria, some of those authorities are really, taking account for their carbon emissions, and they themselves, I think, can be quite a good resource to approach for that kind of information.
Yeah, that's exactly. So, yeah, sorry, that would be exactly what you would do. Yeah, you would, if you had an authority that you could call on, then yeah, referring to those emissions coefficients would be definitely the first step.
Yeah, and interesting also, I've seen the difference in emissions intensity of potable water supply between two towns, where one town is flat and the other town is quite hilly. It can be quite a dramatic difference between those two towns.
Yeah, the energy associated with pumping water is not trivial. Yeah.
And just a clarifying question there, Matt. Is the local water authority not responsible for those emissions from their service provision of providing water and sewerage?
Yeah, so excellent question. So this actually goes back to the scopes. So basically, one thing that's worth bearing in mind is that your scope 3 is someone else's scope 1 or 2 in this instance. Electricity. Yeah. Just throw a spanner in the whole thing. So basically that's it. So yes, that would be their scope 1 emissions. That would be directly, their operational. So that means if you were consuming water, you would deal with the emissions associated with that in the same way that you would deal with, other utility usage, where the essential use of that would be an off-site thing. Now, because it's a third party, so for them, sorry, when I was saying scope 1, obviously their electricity use, they're not generating electricity. So it would be for them a scope 2 electricity. Because it's a third party outside of your control, even though it's electricity for you, it's a scope 3. So because of that operational step down and that you don't have the direct control, it's a scope 3 for you, even though it's electricity.
All right. So just to clarify, potable water use by councils out of the tap would be accountable in your scope 3 emissions.
if it was operated by an independent authority.
Yep.
If you or yourself ran the water supply, then
Yep.
yeah, it would be
Okay.
a scope 2.
So the previous question around is there a difference between raw water, so water out of bores or channels or catchment dams
Mhm.
that council would own and operate?
Mhm.
That would be largely, say, scope 2
So yeah, if you were using electricity, yeah,
yourself,
yeah.
rather than buying water from a
Yeah.
water authority.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, if you're operating it, yes, it just forms. It's functionally exactly the same as stationary building energy use, and so it's a scope 2.
Great. All right. Thanks for your questions. Keep them coming, and we'll keep rolling through.
This is a favourite quote of Lex's. So it's basically we emphasise the fact that we think that inventories and these type of activities should be very much focused on trying to keep it as simple as possible, and should be simply focused on what the objectives are. And there's a lot of good reasons for that. So it makes it more bulletproof, it makes it more dynamic, easier to update, more flexible for other applications and the like. There are some approaches, so if you're going with, say, NCOS, then that obviously locks you into a certain level of complexity.
Do you mean if you're seeking NCOS?
Oh, so carbon neutral. Okay, yes, NCOS certification. So the National Carbon Offset Scheme is basically a mechanism that uses NCOS as a way of providing assurance and compliance. We have recommendations about how to do that. We think NCOS should be very much a strategic decision, and it should be very much understood what the implications now and into the future are going to be.
Can I just clarify there? So I guess what that means is you can use the framework if you like, and you can use NCOS as something that you might want to strive for. But for most councils, unless you're really keen on promoting and marketing the fact that you're carbon neutral, it's not necessary. And it's possibly not a great use of resources.
Yeah.
If you've got the resources, and if it's something that's really important to the community and to council, and it's going to work in, building more action and getting more resources from having that badge, then it's great.
Yeah.
But otherwise, if you're strapped for cash, it's probably not worth your while spending $15,000 on getting the inventory that you've developed third party verified.
Yeah. One thing, practically speaking, no one really wants to be in a situation of where they walk back from an NCOS commitment or something. So in the future, so that means that unless it runs in parallel with a plan to sort of bring down emissions to zero and essentially phase out those costs of, say, buying offsets to actually drive, to come up with a net zero, then I think it just needs to be thought of very strategically. The general approach that we recommend is that get a handle on where emissions are and where the opportunities to move are, and start trying to establish a reasonable projection for how that could trend over time. Take a look at the costs of doing that, and then think about saying okay, so if in 5 years or something, when we're achieving this trajectory, and we got a degree of certainty about where that's going and what we can move on. That means we get much better clarity about saying what is the potential long-term cost impacts of, say, buying off carbon offsets and being NCOS compliant. As part of that equation, initiatives that you implement that lower your emissions are cost-saving measures, and carbon offsets are costs, budget line costs. So from a strategic planning perspective, we just say, just take a look at what the dollar per ton is. For most initiatives around your council, dollar per tons are, they're negative. They're saving you money by reducing your emissions. So it's really once the point of the dollar per ton actually drops below the cost of the NCOS offset purchases. So the viability of further reductions no longer matches the viability of carbon offsets. When you're going, that's when it obviously makes sense to do. And so we think it should be approached from that strategically.
So I suppose one of the other aspects for people to consider with NCOS is, looking at costing out what it would actually require council to be carbon neutral using, a combination of offsets and emissions reductions. Looking at that business case, because you actually effectively have a price on carbon when you're buying an offset.
Yes.
And when we talk generally, we don't necessarily think about having a price on carbon. It is a topical thing for discussion, but I think that can be an interesting avenue for councils to think about. Even if they're not aiming to become NCOS, they can still see, look, what would it cost us if we wanted to achieve carbon neutrality.
100%. I very much encourage any conversation that involves like becoming carbon neutral should do a lot of scenario planning for trying to understand what are the implications going forward. Like, how does this affect our ability to invest in council towards becoming actually carbon neutral? And what are the political implications? What are the risks? What are the uncertainties associated with fluctuations in, say, emissions intensity of electricity, and that kind of thing?
And the point about the simplicity is that for most councils, you can get to a 95 to 99% complete inventory, and that's probably enough. You can spend so much time trying to get that last 1 or 2%, trying to find every last little refrigerant or barbecue gas cylinder or whatever it is around the municipality. If you want that tick of approval from NCOS, you need to be capturing everything. You need to develop one that's supposedly 100%, and then it needs to be verified by a third party. So it's not that it's not a good framework, it's not the carbon neutrality, we're not suggesting that that's not a way to go, but as far as from a reporting point of view is concerned, generally try and keep it simple and look at where your resources.
Yeah, and that goes, I know we've talked about this a couple of times, it goes to the intent. Like, in a lot of ways, the most practical use of carbon inventories are to better identify where it is that your actions should take place. And so that essentially plays an important role in saying, like, well, how accurate does this inventory need to be? And we say internally to Ironbark is that data and accuracy is only as valuable as the decision that it influences or changes. So if it's the case that by increasing the accuracy of some things, by plus or minus like 3% to plus or minus 1%, if it's the case that won't plausibly change a decision you're making, such as around investing in, say, renewable systems or energy efficiency activity, if you're not actually anticipating this to influence a decision, then the actual value of that increase in accuracy is effectively zero. So it should just be like, data should be useful to you and should not be just something that is done for reporting.
So just another quick question from Raj. We're talking about buying offsets effectively. You buy green power that effectively offsets emissions from electricity. For fuel, you can buy offset products. Raj's question is specifically around natural gas. How would you go about offsetting emissions associated with the consumption of natural gas?
Oh, well, it would be like standard carbon offsets. So basically, NGA's recognised offsets.
Okay.
Right. So so there's an accreditation scheme for. So Australia itself has a recognised accreditation scheme, and you just buy offsets compatible with that.
Okay. Great. Hope that answers your question, Raj.
So in regards to reporting, there's an international framework called the Carbon Climate Registry, which is compatible with the Global Covenant of Mayors, and this allows you to basically do a standardised reporting of that, of the emissions associated with your corporate activities, and it also simultaneously allows you to report on municipal activities as well. This is obviously. This connects you through to the sort of the international community and allows you to sort of run comparisons with what's going on internationally. And like the work that we're currently doing and involved with ICLEI and C40 and the like is really how do we take this type of information, this type of collaboration, and make it sort of significantly trying to increase the value proposition to individual councils. So we see that by standardizing the methods that are involved and by creating a framework that allows for much better sharing of that information in a more standardized, formalized way, is a really effective strategy, because what it does is it means that as information is found, and this approach also incorporates things such as quantifications of actions, those kind of initiatives. As we move down that trajectory, it allows for us to all just get better, so more effectively learn the lessons that are being learned across different municipalities globally. And so we definitely feel that this is a really good approach to take in regards to like an application for this data, connecting your council to the global stage. So here we just see that there's basically, so any particular municipality, this one's the City of Austin, United States, identifies key characteristics and aspects of programs that municipality signed up to and the like. We see a similar thing in Australia. So this is Mornington Peninsula Shire. So there, for instance, signed up with that using corporate inventory, and they're showing the compatibility with some of those international frameworks. And it just allows them to connect to that international stage.
This is hypothetical, this one. This doesn't say Take Two, but it could.
Yeah. So we see the direction of Take Two as sort of seamlessly integrating into this framework of reporting. And it's just such a natural complement for the way that that's done. And yeah, again, we'll sort of add value to that as it sort of moves into that framework. Now, just this slide here, obviously, is quite small, points if you can read it. But what it's doing is it's essentially identifying the type of activities and actions that councils can implement. There's obviously a range of actions, and many of you would be very familiar with a lot of them. There's sort of different reasons for why that you would pursue actions. Obviously, a lot of this conversation is about reducing carbon emissions, but there's obviously utility cost savings, bottom line impacts. There's other environmental benefits and the like. There's leadership roles within the community, and these should rightly form part of your considerations for how to approach this. Another important consideration that we would argue is that we understand that carbon emissions reduction is a global problem, and so we can say the word community problem in that regard. So it's like the expectation is that we're all going to need to work together to solve this. So what we would argue is that council should be increasingly looking towards any work they do around the corporate emissions as essentially simply being a part of their engagement with the community and moving the community towards a zero emissions framework. Council's emissions typically constitute between 1% to 2% of your total municipals framework, so the actual council activities themselves are 1% to 2% of total emissions within your municipality. And so we are basically saying we should really be viewing council's activities to reduce their own emissions are essentially a community engagement activity, an activity to reduce municipal emissions, targeting the things that councils can do most effectively. So that means we see a seamless expansion. So once we start viewing that within that framework, then things that move across stuff that reduces council's emissions and moves more into reduction of emissions for municipal entities, say through introduction of bike lanes or FOGO waste diversions and that kind of thing. We see that there's no longer that need to make that strong delineation. The conversations starts to go, well, it's to the benefit of the greater community, and it's all part of that same puzzle. Yeah.
Just a clarification on offsets and green power. Had some really good feedback from people who are viewing the webinar, so thank you. Just a comment here that it's important that green power should be presented can be presented as an either-or proposition.
Yes.
In relation to offsets.
Yep.
So you can buy green power, or you can directly offset your emissions by purchasing offsets yourself.
Yes, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's just a strategic decision, and functionally, green power is really an offset. And from that perspective, it is certified, it's documented in the same manner, and so it's they're an either or. So green power is essentially a electricity specific offset. So is that
right? Yeah. Just wanted to clarify that point.
Yeah. There is an additional comment here. So we have the Australian Local Government's Climate Review. This is a document that has been put together with Ironbark in conjunction with ICLEI and Beyond Zero Emissions. And so it's a reasonably comprehensive picture. It's actually got quite a good representation of councils across the country and an excellent picture of councils in Victoria. And it basically is looking, it's the most comprehensive attempt thus far to benchmark where councils sit in regards to the sort of work they're doing, the approaches, connecting actions, trying to quantify actions, Councillor Stewing. We're going to be presenting on that when in a couple of
You
weeks.
can download that straight away online on our website or BZE's, or I think everyone's got it at the moment, but
Yeah.
just click it.
Yeah,
And that graph there comes from that report.
And so we did, like I said, we did all the numbers for it. So, and we would be really happy if there's any questions or any other things. There's actually a bunch of additional insights that can be drawn from that data set. We've been using some of them, and we have actually presented on a couple of them before. And we very much are sort of excited at the opportunity of trying to better understand practice. And our objective with this has been to say, like, well, how do we basically best direct local government to take action on these issues in a way that is the most effective dollar value.
Great. We're roughly halfway through the 2 hours now, so we might just pause for 5 minutes, stretch your legs, get a glass of water, and we'll be back in about 5 minutes. So by my clock, that makes it roughly 7 minutes past 11 that we'll come back. Yeah, take a break, and we'll get going again in a few minutes. Okay, welcome back everybody. Hoping we're coming through nice and clear again after that short break. We will roll back into the rest of the webinar. So we've got about 40 odd minutes left. So sit back and enjoy the carbon accounting.
Thank you.
It's really solid.
Yes. It's over to me now to just quickly talk about the local government's Energy Savers program corporate inventory tool. I'm just going to touch on this really quickly because in the next webinar we're going to get into data management in a bit more detail. Suffice to say, through the program, which has been the 22 eligible councils and 19 that we're working with, an inventory tool has been developed that can assist councils to develop their own corporate inventory. There is a guide that comes with it, and it's an Excel-based tool. Basically, what it means is that you put information into an Excel tool around your buildings, your sites, your electricity use, the sort of things that Matt was talking about before around emissions coefficients or emissions factors, and it spits out the data. You probably can't see these, so I actually am going to skip through them quite quickly, but there can be a few little intricacies when it comes to the sort of information that you put in, and this is something that you have to deal with regardless of what you use. So councils can use internal spreadsheets, and many have. Councils can use the likes of Planet Footprint, Eden Suite, other third-party providers, or go and get bespoke tools developed by consultants. There's a lot of different tools out there, and this will continue to happen. What we've got here is a tool that will be available to all councils. Needs to be updated. You need to, every year put in the latest emissions factors or the latest data. And again, we might actually do a live example at the next webinar to take you through what it entails. But basically, at the end of the day, it spits out sort of pie charts that Matt was providing earlier on and tells you where your emissions are coming from. If there are no questions around that, and I'm hoping there aren't because we will just go through that in detail next week, we might then, or in 2 weeks' time, move on to community greenhouse emissions profile. So we've spoken at length about the corporate organisational inventories. It's now on to broader community profiles. Now, the language may seem a little bit semantic, but from our point of view, it is quite important. And I also would encourage people in the questions to disagree with this as well. We totally understand that this is an area where people have different views, and our thinking, Ironbark's thinking on this has changed a lot in the last couple of years, and we've been working really closely with the alliances especially, and I thank the alliances for giving us their time as we've discussed these particular issues over the last couple of years on how exactly to work on community emissions data into the future, because there have been a lot of challenges over the last few decades that some of us around this table and some of us watching, I know, have faced through programs such as ICLEI's Cities for Climate Protection, the data that we used to get through ABS and ABARE, etc. We've got a bit of a change in thinking, which is firstly that the community, it's not a community inventory, and it never has been. So an inventory sort of alludes to the fact that you've got a list of items like property, so you can actually say, here's our billing data, here are the widgets A, B, C, D, and E, this is our inventory, whereas a profile is more a characteristic or a description of the characteristics of something. When it comes to community data, it's a profile, and it always has been a profile. With corporate, you've got the data, you've got the amount of fuel that is being used from your vehicles. With community, you've got high-level information that you're trying to, break down to your postcodes and to your local government area. It has always been this way. We can get better information, we think, around certain parts of a community profile. So, for example, for stationary energy, we try and get data from distribution businesses that we think and we hope will actually tell us what the postcode's energy use is. But as we'll get into in a little bit in the next half an hour, even with that, there are some pretty significant limitations. We spoke about the standards and the protocols that we have for corporate emissions before. NGERS, NCOS. When it comes to community, standard is GPC. The Global Protocol for Community Scale Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventories, and as mentioned before, Matt was involved in the development of this profile. Importantly, we have a protocol here that has been agreed upon and developed by councils and leading local government organisations around the world. So all of these guys are on the same page. This is important because it means that there's no double counting, there's no duplication of emissions, and emissions aren't being missed. When we talk about the way this interacts or intercedes with what's happening at an international level, Paris specifically gave local government and subnational government bodies a seat at the table when it comes to what's happening at a global level. That means, or part of what that means, is that councils and states need to be able to sum up all of their emissions, and we need to find that if we've got 79 councils in Victoria and you add the emissions for each of those 79 councils, you get the same thing as what we would find if we had a state-based emissions profile. So the state of Victoria equals the same as those 79. So having a protocol that everyone agrees on is really important. The likes of C40 cities, UCLG, ICLEI, and some of these larger international organisations all got involved to develop this protocol. When we're talking about community emissions, we're talking about stationary energy, so electricity for residential, commercial and industrial sites. We're talking about transport, so cars, trucks, trains, airplanes, and we're talking about waste. They're the three main sectors. And if you cover off on all of those three, you have what is called a basic profile. Basic, capital B, capital A, capital S-I-C. Does it actually stand for anything? It just means basic, but they've capitalised it.
Look, if it stands for something, I reckon it's something pretty bad.
Yeah. Most councils that have developed a GPC compliant profile in Australia have developed one that covers the basic sources, so these three. Internationally, councils have looked a little bit further than this by looking at basic plus sources, which is agriculture, forestry, land use, industrial processes, etc. We know that a lot of councils over the past have looked into certain areas. So, for example, rural and regional councils have looked at their agricultural emissions. What we don't have or haven't seen yet in Australia anyway is what is called a basic plus profile, which covers everything that we see there. We will again next webinar get into a little bit more detail about the data itself. So, for example, zero in a bit on stationary energy, which is made up of residential, commercial, and industrial, and some of the challenges and where to find those data sources. But for now, I guess it's really just stating the fact that we do have this at the high level. So we also talk about scopes, but probably the best way to conceptualize it is according to these sectors.
So there's just been a question asked about, is the state of Victoria on board with, community emissions profile? I guess the response to that is it's a relatively new emissions accounting protocol. It's being developed from a global perspective, and it's a relatively new space that we're really still evolving and trying to understand.
Look, yes and no. So they wouldn't use GPC to develop the state inventory, or would they? No. So this is specifically for local governments and municipalities. Certainly there is alignment. So the idea is that the state government, without a doubt, would be using international protocols, so the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, that will actually align with GPC. And the other thing to bear in mind, so we've spoken to people at DELP a little bit to make sure there is alignment. The other thing to bear in mind is that a lot of the profiles that we've been developing, we're using the same data sources. So we're using the same sort of state-based data sources that they would be using.
Yeah, or sources from like aggregators such as
Yes.
the NSPs. Just very briefly, so when we were talking before about those two essentially sources of information about methods and factors nationally. So there's the NGAs, which is like corporate focused, and then there's the National Inventory Guidelines document. So the National Inventory Guidelines document is itself derived from data that is sourced from the 2006 guidelines published by the IPCC, right? So the entity that we're all basically connecting all this through to. So it's utilizing a system, like a bunch of methods that are developed from that framework, a little while ago now. Like the important difference here is that that thinking and that protocol was developed with looking at regions and nations in mind, right? Where GPC differs is its specific focus is around cities, but it's been built in such a way so that it easily aggregates across regions and the like. They're all drawing essentially from the same data set, but you could view GPC as essentially a next iteration on that. It provides a bit more sophistication with how it deals with things such as boundaries and delineations, really trying to emphasize geographical delineations to facilitate cities doing this work. And but a lot of the basic functionality is still consistent. So like when we do numbers around some of the methods that we employ when we're doing, say, GPC profiles, it actually utilizes the methods derived from the IPCC 2006 guidelines. So they all sort of tie together, but broadly GPC is essentially the next iteration, and it's done in a way that allows for, like, it's thinking about seamless integration from cities up to states.
All right, well, I hope that answers your question. I guess the basis I took away from that is that we're all drawing on common data here to calculate emissions at different scales. And if a local government was interested in a GPC for their community, it's totally up to them. It's an avenue they can explore and do some research and move towards doing that basic community profile.
If you're developing a community profile yourself, you certainly want to make sure that it's aligned and compliant with GPC at the moment. So we're working with C40 in the City of Melbourne to do a Metropolitan Melbourne GPC profile, and a lot of councils through the Local Government Energy Savers program likewise have developed one as well. But there's little doubt that if you're developing a community profile, you need to be aligning with GPC. It is the protocol. So this is a typical community profile that we see in front of us here. Again, typical is an interesting word, but basically most councils, municipalities within Australia will have a very large part which is stationary energy, and then transportation, and then less for waste and wastewater. This, of course, is a basic profile, so we don't have ag, forestry, land use, industrial processes, etc. If we were to include those sources within a community profile, then that could change. Matt talked about the councils that have got corporate emissions inventories at the moment, or say that they have, and it's about 60–70% that do. Vast majority of councils around Australia do not. This is based on the aforementioned survey that we undertook with Beyond Zero Emissions, and equally this is consistent with what we've seen a lot over the last 10 years whenever we've spoken to councils or surveyed councils, and also anecdotally. Reason being, it's really challenging to get the data, and it can be a little bit confusing. Similarly, community profiles can be reported. So once they've actually been developed themselves internally, there is an international place where these can be put. We'd suggest, so the Global Covenant of Mayors. And so if you're a council that is committed to Take Two and pledged to Take Two, which you certainly should have, likewise, international programs that align with Take Two, such as the Global Covenant, there are ways and places where you can report on your community profile as well. This is an example for the City of Port Phillip, who have done so, and I believe have committed to all of these major programs. And so they've got their community emissions profile up online. You can go onto that website and find community profiles for any council, any municipality that has committed or has uploaded their information. And the point that Matt made about the ability to aggregate and to compare is pretty important, which is why you need to have that common protocol that underpins it all. You would have seen this is a similar graph or infograph to the one that we had earlier. And this is really just, again, to link back the fact that this is all done to, and only really to ensure that there's action. This is from the aforementioned survey, and if you do download the survey, you can get a big version of this, but it will tell you what councils are currently doing in regards to community action and interventions around Australia, and there's a fair bit of information and case studies there. This is the one that I think is probably most important, especially when it comes to how we compare community profiles with corporate inventories, because for a long time we've sort of assumed that we've got this data for corporate and we've got this data for community, and here's one inventory and here's another, when in actual fact they are really different. And our take is that it's time to really change the way we think about greenhouse reporting for community. The first thing is that a community profile compliant, aligned to GPC, is not an inventory. We've established that, and it's not a baseline, and it never has been a baseline. We can't think of it as something that here we are in 2016, 17, 18, and here's where we're going to get to. This is what we've done in the past as a sector. In the early 2000s, there were about 200 odd councils around Australia that had what they called community inventories and community baselines. And of course, they changed so much year on year that it became very confusing and possibly counterproductive. It's also possible that a council can have multiple compliant profiles depending on the methodology. So while we do have this protocol that underpins it, for example, you can suddenly incorporate basic plus elements like ag and forestry, and you've got a different profile. So don't get too hung up on what the data says and what those numbers are, because it's really changeable. And also, it's not a very good methodology for reporting success, which we'll go into in a second.
Just getting a message. We're sort of a bit out of frame.
Oh,
You want to get cozy?
no worries.
All good?
All right. Hope that's a bit better, everybody.
Thank you. Now, this area, if anybody disagrees with this and says, nah, we've got a community inventory, we'd love to see it. Or if you think it's a baseline and here's how it's worked and how it will work in the future, again, really up for discussion, but this is based on considerable experience in this field over the last few decades. When it comes to corporate thinking, we have, this would be a typical sort of graph that's in the action plans or previous action plans of probably most councils in Australia, certainly in Victoria, where you have your emissions that you have from each of your sectors, and we look at how they're increasing or decreasing over the years, landfill, public lighting, etc. What we've tried to do over the last decade or two is then apply a similar sort of approach to community, where we've got our emissions by scope or by emission source and put them in graphs, and sort of allude to the fact that we're quite comfortable and quite confident in the numbers that we have. Another very similar graph, another graph that most people will be familiar to, where we have a baseline and we have a forecast and we have a target. And so again, for corporate, we've seen similar graphs to this repeated over and over again, where we want to reduce our emissions by a certain amount in a target year into the future. And what we have often tried to do is apply this thinking to the community side of things. Or we use things like marginal abatement curves, where we have a community profile, which we've previously called a baseline, and then we've tried to tie all of our actions to meeting or to reducing targets to reduce that baseline. So for example, here we're going to put solar on all residential facilities, we're going to put solar on commercial, we're going to get rid of gas, we're going to go off grid, walking school buses to get kids out of cars, etc. We're going to do all this stuff and we're going to reduce that baseline. However, what happens frequently is all of the great community projects that a council has control over, or let alone influence over, lie within the margin of error of this original baseline. That could be off by a lot. If it's off by 2 or 3%, that's a bit of an issue. It could generally be off by 20 or 30%. And that's what we've seen consistently over the last decade. When we've done what we call inventories or re-profiles over the years, they go up and down wildly. and then we get really mad.
And if anyone has a time or interest, I would be very interested in having a conversation about like how these things happen, like why do these things change, and what is our level of uncertainty with the different sources of emissions.
The data will improve, so it's hard to talk local government technology without smart cities coming up these days, but smarter data and smarter cities will give us better data in the future. There's no doubt about it. A good example here is with transport. So transport is probably one at the moment where there is the most amount of variability. So if you think about a car that's coming, or a truck that's coming in through one municipality and out through another, possibly going through 3 or 4 in the meantime, who actually has carriage of those emissions? There is the GPC explains what to do and where the emissions should go, but we can't track that. We don't have access to those vehicles at the moment, so we don't know how many of those car journeys are happening within our municipality to any great detail. It is possible to spend a lot of money, spend millions of dollars on transport data to try and find out, what's happening in your municipality and the cars and trucks going in and out. But as Matt sort of discussed before about the value of that data, we'd argue that it's not that valuable. If you're going to try and, you might figure out that transport's actually 24% instead of 22.5% of your community profile. So what? That's not actually going to make any difference to what you're going to do, the actions and the interventions. We'd consider you better off even waiting, because cars these days have smartphones in them. This is how we know that there are traffic issues coming up. This is when Google Maps comes up and tells you that, it's red in a certain area. We now know that there is something moving at 60 kilometres an hour that suddenly stops, and that is a car. There are a few pilots in Europe where they're actually using that big data from the likes of Google to try and assist in creating better GPC profiles. Once we see how those pilots come out and use that data a lot better, you can also, link it or correlate it to the size of the vehicle, for example. We will in the future be able to have a lot more accurate profiles that relate to even transport, which have been the more problematic sort of sectors in the past. Likewise, we have smart meters in Victoria. We just need to find out a way to actually use them. Distribution business data. There are 2 ways or there are probably a handful of ways that we can find electricity stationary emissions. So we've got commercial, industrial and residential. We can use state-based or broader high-level figures, or we can try and get more detailed data from distribution businesses. And if we had this presentation 6 to 12 months ago, I probably would have said that what we need to do, and the holy grail, is to get onto these guys and get their data. And if we can find out postcode information, what the electricity use, the kilowatt hours is for each postcode around Victoria, then we are actually going to be able to say, from a stationary energy point of view anyway, what we have is an inventory, and we can be really confident in what we've got. What we've found over the last couple of months only is that this is not necessarily the case. There's a few reasons. One, the distribution businesses themselves have told us this. They have said, for example, for certain years, when it comes to their data, don't use it for creating an inventory or a profile because it is not accurate. The second thing is we've got no way of actually getting to the source data itself. So councils have access occasionally to distribution business data where they'll send you spreadsheets with postcodes and the kilowatt hours that are used over a given period of time. But you don't know where that's come from, and they might use different methodologies at a different time. And we've had a few examples of that in the past couple of months, I think. Do you want to touch on 1 or 2 of those, I think, where we've seen really big differences within a few months where suddenly, even for residential energy, a postcode goes up or down by 20-30% in any given month and then comes down again?
Yeah, basically, the key problem here is that the method of undertaking these queries are developed somewhat ad hoc by the different distributors, like on a query by query basis. And so there are some natures into the way they construct the queries that means that allocations are done in certain ways that some things fall in certain categories versus others, and also they apply over the top of that discretion about the release of information for where so certain geographical regions, they have less than a certain threshold of accounts, such as 10, and there's not very much transparency about any parts of these processes. What it means is that we have uncertainty in regards to whether or not queries done, say, between distributors or even at the same distributor over multiple queries, if the variation that we see in the data that's being provided is actually due to genuine variation, or if it's due to just simply reconstructing or altering the nature of the queries they're making of their own databases. That being said, there's a number of additional considerations in regards to the application of things such as concordances. So distributors don't store information according to municipal boundaries. They store account information with one of the characteristics being postcodes, so they'll present the information in postcodes, but they may or may not provide transparency about whether or not they've applied the proportion of the postcode that correlates to, say, the municipality making the request. And even if they did, those concordances actually do themselves change over time, so the contemporary nature of that data set is also not known. What it basically amounts to is that it's difficult to establish confidence over what data is being provided, and when you see variability, if you can say with confidence that variability is in fact due to local variation and not simply variation due to the nature of the query. We're working pretty closely on this, and we've been doing a lot of work with, say, Delp and with distributors to try and standardize the nature of those requests.
Thank you. As an example, we might have a situation where a distribution business will provide information postcode level and say, here you go, here it is for residential, here it is for industrial, and here it is for commercial. And we'll have a look and check, and it's very different to what we would expect, or very different to neighbouring municipalities. It might be 30–40% less than what's expected. So you go back to the distribution business and you say, I think you might have missed a few things here. Perhaps you haven't got all the industrial data, and they will assure you that everything is there. Prodding a few times, what often happens is a couple of weeks down the track, they'll then say, oh no, we actually didn't include our industrial data because there's one or two big data industrial energy users, and so we have to de-identify them. That is not uncommon. So I think it's a matter of, it's a longer term process to get the data from the distribution businesses. We don't think it makes sense as well for an individual council or an individual organisation to do this. Ideally, it would be at a state level or even higher up, because what's happening at the moment is the distribution businesses will be having requests from, say, the City of Moreland wanting distribution business data. Then they'll have the same request from Naga. Then they'll have the same request from from Delp or whoever it might be, or from Ironbark. And so they're wondering what's going on. It makes much more sense for it to be consolidated at state level, and the state's actually saying, let's get this data and then provide it to all the relevant parties, councils, alliances, consultants, whoever it might be. That I think will take a bit of time though. Also make sure that we've got a way that we can check it ourselves to make sure that it's accurate.
I will just add a quick comment. You might be interested in how was it the case that we expressed skepticism about, say, the data provided by a distributor? And this actually raises a really important point with how to approach data. And so we place an emphasis about doing a hierarchical approach. So we start out by we basically model. So we try and build up a picture about what we think the data should be based off broader characteristics and the relationships that we know with activity data and emissions. This allows us to essentially, for all municipalities, be able to do a projection of what we think should be the case for emissions for that area. Once we have that in place, then we can get emissions, or say utility consumption data locally, and then we can contrast it with that. We have a point of reference to be able to say, we're expecting the data to fall within a certain boundary, and that means when we see that to be the case, then we have confidence that that data is accurate. When we see a discrepancy between the local data and, say, the way that we've done the modeling projections, it doesn't mean we reject one or the other outright. It just means that we're going this needs to be investigated more closely. So what it will mean is that, because we've been incrementally building over time better and better regressions that where we've been able to get verified local data and we run it against the way we run our models and we get the uncertainty. So we're currently approaching uncertainties in the vicinity of 5-6%. So that means we expect a new profile, so a new local data to be in that vicinity. If it varies substantially out of that, we need to interrogate it further. And that's often where we find that the results show that there's issues with the local data.
Okay, we were going to have another break here, but maybe we'll just move on because
We've got about 20 minutes.
we've got
left.
20 minutes to go. Okay, no dramas. And let's just see what we had coming up over here. Oh, we had Q&A over here. There we go. We've skipped through this a lot quicker than expected. I'm feeling lonely here. There are no community questions. It's all been about corporate to Matt. We can keep talking and waxing lyrical about some of the issues that come up or the benefits and value of the community profiles or otherwise.
There's a couple of, I think one, maybe two questions we didn't quite cover off corporate. So maybe we'll cover those. And if you've got some community questions, start typing them now and we'll come back to them. So just going back here, there was a point of clarification around green power and offsets again. Just the question is green power considered as double counting when seeking carbon neutral certification? So under the NCOS program.
Double counting.
As in double counting the emissions.
Oh, so is it being, has green power already been counted, for instance, by the national government? Is that what's meant?
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm assuming so. If you've got a clarification, whoever asked that question, I can't tell who asked it, but their question specifically is just to clarify, is green power not considered as double accounting when seeking carbon neutral certification? So I guess the question is, has somebody else already claimed the emission offsets, the emissions reduction associated with that green power outside of the person who's actually purchasing that power?
So I guess it's just, it depends on how you view the boundaries, but functionally, no. Like you're buying the offset similar to how you buy a carbon offset. Like if you're looking at it from the perspective of the way that Australia is committed to achieving reductions internationally, then there is an intersection with like how green power is accounted from that perspective. But that's well outside of like the individual council. Like to say the individual entity. Yeah, so you can. It's not double counting. It's simply just a electricity specific offset.
Okay, that's great. I hope that answers the question. And we'll go back a little further. There hasn't been any community questions come through yet, but please pose them if you have them. The last question we didn't quite get to earlier on was from East Gippsland, and we did cover part of it around why emission factors change through time. Yeah. The sort of the further part of that question was if there is a change in the emissions factor between the years, when do you apply that to your accounting? So I guess the question is, when are the emission factors reset?
Yeah. No worries. So the national inventory factors are released annually, so they do an annual update. I think so. July.
So those are on usually a financial year basis?
Oh, you don't. All right. So they, the specifications within the document itself, as to like the time period specifically that the emissions factors associate with, are financial year. But that in no way obligates you to use financial year. It would be easy to divide up your emissions, so your consumption according to the 6-month overlaps with different periods, and then apply the relevant factors. So that's fine, if that's the nature of the query. If you're looking for there's two changes essentially that can occur. So it's possible for them to do a revision retroactively of previous years. So to say like 2015, they're going in emissions factors this, and then a later release goes, actually 2015 was this other thing. In which case, it's sort of like optional as to how you would approach that. But essentially the most common, like as in legitimately optional, you can look to obviously retroactively adjust your data from that period, which is what we would recommend, because then it would be consistent. But like essentially you just you're not automatically obligated to do that revision. There's and then there's like the more common thing, which is like as a new period rolls around, they release a new factor for the contemporary year, in which case then obviously we just apply the factors to the year in which you're doing the inventory.
So as we have financial years and we have fringe benefit years, is there a commonly agreed annual period for which emissions are reported in? Is it a calendar year or a financial year?
It's not commonly agreed. I would say that in general, what we see is with NGERS reporting, so corporate inventory reporting, generally it is financial. With GPC, generally it's calendar. But again, neither of those formats require those reporting regimes.
I think it's totally up to council as far as we're concerned, but it's one or the other. That's an interesting point as far as and next question also talked about the big decrease we had in stationary energy from 2016 to 17 or whatever it might be, which sort of is another reason why we don't suggest that you take too much of a stake in your profile, because that impact of that reduction in the coefficient is going to be significant, and it's probably going to make more of a difference within your community profile than putting solar on every roof. You close a Hazelwood, you get a really big reduction. And also the point they retroactively sometimes change the emissions coefficients for previous years is another reason why it's not, don't get too hung up on actually what those exact numbers are, because they're not exact. You will find that there can be changes that are made after the point.
Yeah. Oh man, and when you get into it, there are so many different reasons for why they could change. Like one of the things I was looking into was essentially really trying to understand what was the nature of the coefficients associated with gas production. And so a key part of that was looking into essentially and the reason why it was driven there was because we wanted to try and understand what the implications of changing to where fracking became a contributor to the gas supply. And because there was in fact no revision made to those figures as a result of fracking, I was intrigued by that and looked into the specific basis by which these numbers are derived. So in particular, when we look at the data sets that were used to derive emissions associated with gas use in Australia, there are a few different sources, but the majority of information is actually sourced from a series of trials that were done in the United States during the 90s by gas companies themselves. So when we think about the applicability, and obviously that predates fracking, so the applicability is, there's essentially a bunch of different things that are used to build these pictures, and we all try to be accurate with them. And we're not throwing our hands up in the air and saying this is all, it's not possible to be accurate. But I think what we want to do is we want to try and encourage a conversation whereby we're saying this type of inventory and profiling should be viewed within the context of that it's a moving solution. We're expecting the numbers to change, the methods, the data sets that are used, the assumption sets, what's included and what's excluded. We want it to be streamlined, transparent in the way it's documented, repeatable, collatable across areas. There's one aspect of the new way, there's a new tool that's developed for creating and aggregating community inventories. It's called Cirrus. And one of the great features of Cirrus is that it allows you to essentially do a selection between a bunch of different ways of drawing the municipal boundary, right? And I think this is exactly the type of communications that we want to present. We want to say there is not one hard and fast profile. You make profiles that are useful for you for certain comparisons. And so for instance, having a profile that includes agriculture, or having a basic plus, or other types of profiles allows you to do comparisons between other regional groups or other entities of that nature, or electricity, stationary energy and the like.
So we've had another question come through, sort of along the lines of emissions and scopes, or emissions and coefficients, but it's particularly around biomass. And it's probably a relatively new, not as broadly accepted and utilised energy generation source in Australia. It is growing.
Yep.
How are the emissions accounted for in biomass? Contrasting against coal or mineral gas. Is there some coefficients around biogas yet for us to use?
So it's just worth bearing in mind essentially the role that it plays. So there's two factors that influence it. So one is essentially the nature of the source of the biomass that's used, and then there's the nature of the combustion or the conversion that takes place. So the source, basically, if it's a transitory or like a regenerating source, then that means by and large, it's got just by default a zero emissions coefficient. All right, and so the reasoning is because, and when we're talking about like this renewable recharging resource, we're talking about things such as, you know, say biomass from agricultural wastes, you know, sugarcane, you know, those sort of things, even like plantations, so tree plantations, things that have, where the carbon that's stored in them and is being converted to energy now is of a recent extraction from the atmosphere. So if that's the case, then, you know, we're sort of working on the assumption that it's largely zero. It's not necessarily completely zero because the combustion process itself, so obviously the extraction of resource of carbon, GHG emission gases from the atmosphere is done purely through carbon dioxide. So they're only taking carbon dioxide and converting it. The release gases may be a number of different gases, but primarily either carbon dioxide, methane, or nitrous oxide. So depending on the conversion and the efficiency of that conversion process, there may be, and methane and nitrous oxide goes without saying, both have significant multipliers over carbon dioxide. So that might change the balance of that. But essentially that's how it's reflected.
Yeah, so I guess the importance is there is if it's a recent carbon sequestration, say from a pine plantation that's then burnt to create heat, you could consider that carbon neutral. But emissions from the exhaust from those biomass plants have to be really carefully monitored because they're emitting other greenhouse gas, active gases like methane or nitrous oxide. They're not necessarily resequestered back into that plantation through time.
Yeah, so that means that there'll be a factor there. It'll be very low, but it won't be necessarily zero. And so the obvious exception there is if they're clearing lands and using the trees cleared from that land to run the biomass facility, then that is not now a zero net emissions because that forest previously was a store of carbon and now it's not there anymore. But that categorization is done differently. So it's not like the energy generation is now dirty. It's still calculated in the same way, but now you have emissions associated with land use. So essentially that land clearing is a separate factor. It's actually in the basic plus modules, but it's now a non-zero.
So not a complex area. And just a final question before we wrap up in about a minute or two, but why does a profile have to be repeatable? What does that mean? Why do we have to be able to repeat profiles?
Sure. So basically, it's this is a really good question, right? Because it means you're thinking in regards to like what is the point of the exercise. So I would argue, firstly, to say like it doesn't need to be repeatable. Like there's and it goes back to the point of like you don't need a profile at all. Like you've got broadly an idea, you know, say whatever you've got like in this idea, you know, things that are going on in the community. If you're doing things where you're confident that the actions are going to be emissions reducing, then you can simply implement that without any sort of profile or inventory or anything to that effect. However, like the reason why you would want to pursue having a profile or inventory is because firstly, it allows you to do some validation of your assumptions about what exists in the community. It allows you to connect to things such as other entities, municipalities. You can connect to sort of the global protocols and the global communities associated with that. And so that sort of, and that brings some utility, the ability to sort of learn and share knowledge about what to do and where to take action and who your relevant peer groups are and things like that. In regards to like the repeatability of it, the reason why you do it is because, and you know, if we're going through like how it's not the case that necessarily with the scale of actions that you're currently implementing, that you can necessarily track those actions that you're implementing in your community. And so then you go, oh, well, why revise the profile? There's a couple of reasons. So one is the intent is over time that we will get better and better at measuring local emissions. In addition to that, over time, we're expecting that we're going to get better and better as municipalities and as organizations and state government are like better at collaborating and acting upon emission sources. And so as those things converge, we're expecting that we will be in a situation of where we are meaningfully updating the inventory of your municipality in a way that reflects the actions specific to that municipality. So it's sort of a long-term objective. The reason why we're not advocating we're doing that right now is because, as we outlined, doing the profile is not without costs, right? So it's like increasing the accuracy is a cost-heavy exercise at this stage. We're focused on implementing processes that keep that cost manageable and low, and ideally continuously lower. So that means you can get better and better at data in more and more closer to real time as we transition. As actions and the interventions expand and become more effective across municipalities, it becomes more important to know them accurately. So that's really a key question. Then for the immediate short term, the reason why you want to revise your profiles is because what we want to do is, like, functionally what we're doing is we're saying, like, we're aiming for what we're aiming for zero new carbon emissions in a future scenario, right? So we're not, like, these are obviously things that are happening in the future, and so that means we need to try and guess where we're going to be, like the other factors that will be in existence, like our population and economic activity and stuff. Other factors in the future we're trying to predict. Updating your profile does allow you to revise what those projections are. Like, did the population increase by 5% or 10% or something? Or did it, has the changes in the emissions coefficient changed the fact that now we're majority, transport fuels or something? So what it allows you to do is to do a recalibration of the scale and focus of your programs.
Can I add, I know we're a minute to go or so, just my take on that as well from a repeatability point of view, and give an example or two as well, and as well just on the tracking. It's not to say don't track the intervention or the action itself. If you're doing a residential solar program or bike paths or whatever it is and trying to get more people out of cars, there needs to be monitoring and evaluation and tracking. The key is decouple that from your profile, because it's not like a corporate thinking where you've got a inventory and then you do certain things and you'll see this big pillar at the start to go down. Don't do it that way. Certainly track, but don't relate it to the baseline, because there is no baseline.
Yeah.
And the other point, just as an example of something that wouldn't be repeatable and still has value, it just doesn't have value in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions profile. Transport's a good one. So you could be doing a lot of tracking of or surveying, for example, of bikes on a bike path in your municipality. Now, that's probably not repeatable unless you're going to do it at the same time, the same place every year for the next 100 years. And ideally, it's done on every bike path in the country at the same time as well, so we can actually compare across municipalities. That is not going to be valuable at all for the greenhouse gas emissions profile. It's not to say it's not going to be very valuable if you're looking at actually trying to improve that bike path or trying to get people, trying to implement active transport and sustainable transport methods. It's just a matter of decoupling those two things. So repeatable is really important in regards to developing that community profile. It doesn't mean that it's not something that can be done separately. GPC protocol, like a lot of the protocols, like accounting protocols, will also have certain criteria, and accuracy is actually low down on the list. So completeness and relevance and transparency are considered much more important when it comes to data sources than accuracy, because the whole point is, the first thing is we want to get something that's complete, something that is really transparent, so we're clearly saying this is in and this is out, and then in the future we improve on that accuracy, but we've got a good place to start.
Great. All right, well, I think it's probably a good place to think about ending today. There was just a final question from one of the viewers asking whether they'd missed the Local Government Energy Saver tool. No, you didn't. We did only cover that fairly briefly in this webinar, but we'll be going through that in some more detail in webinar 2, which I think Lex has put up on the screen, which is on the 30th of May, so the end of the month. And we'll actually be attempting to go through a bit of a live example of working in that tool on Excel. Or if we can't manage that, we'll be working through some screenshots of that tool. And Sustainability and Ironbark, Sustainability Victoria and Ironbark will be sharing that tool more broadly with the Victorian local government sector in the coming weeks. So look out for that. And if you want to know more, get in touch with us or with Ironbark or your local SV regional coordinator, and we'll support you in accessing that tool and learning more about it. So I think that's it for today. If you haven't already done so, please don't forget to register via Eventbrite for the next 2 webinars, and also keep an eye out in your inbox for some more information on the carbon accounting training program as it comes to hand. Thanks for your attention. Thank you, Ironbark, for coming in this morning, and look forward to doing this again at the end of the month.
Sounds great.
Okay, goodbye everybody.
See you later.